Jeremy Ethier just dropped a $40,000 training study claiming to prove the stretch wrong. Today, I'm breaking down his study, what he got right, what he may have missed, and whether or not you should change your training based on this study. I'll give my own personal thoughts and takeaways from this study at the end of the video.
I just spent over $40,000 on this study to prove everyone wrong. Because recently, the entire fitness community has become obsessed with the same thing.
I'm all on the stretch wave these days.
Ultra focus on the stretch.
And now you get a much bigger stretch here.
The theory is if you modify an exercise to stretch your muscle more or challenge it in the stretch, it now becomes S tier for growth. And to be fair, I said the exact same thing. And for good reason, as we had dozens of studies supporting this idea. But despite all this research, the evidence backing our claims, it has some massive holes in it. And there's a real chance this obsession with the stretch is completely overblown. So, to find out, I assembled an elite research team, brought in custom machines, and spent an entire year running one of the most comprehensive studies ever done. All to answer one simple question. Is the stretch really the key to building more muscle?
Right off the bat, really cool study. I've co-authored numerous studies on the stretch, and I've even conducted my own meta-analysis on the stretch itself. So I'm very familiar with the literature on the stretch. As such, I think I can give a good opinion on Jeremy's study and what he's talking about here. Using prime machines to investigate the impact of resistance profile on hypertrophy. Using MRI, looking at muscles that we don't usually look at. With that being said, and I realize this is a bit of YouTube pizzazz, claiming this one study is going to answer that question and or potentially overturn, as he mentioned, dozens of studies, probably isn't quite right. After all, there's a reason we have a hierarchy of evidence, where randomized controlled trials are certainly a solid form of evidence, but meta-analyses and systematic reviews of several dozen studies rank a fair bit higher.
And the result we found didn't just shock me.
Do these findings change your thoughts on some of the exercises that you may have thought better for growth?
Kind of. Yeah, I think.
But before we get there, it's important to understand what the stretch actually means.
I'm going to call it now. The reason Jeff was smiling there a little bit is because this is ultimately just one study, and so kind of is the appropriate response no matter what happens. Because the consensus on this matter should only shift by a certain amount based on how much new evidence there actually is. And in this case, with the consensus being based on several dozen studies and this being a single experimental study, the consensus should absolutely shift, whether the results are positive or negative, but only by about this much.
Actually means and where all the hype came from. So we've actually known about the benefits of stretching a muscle for growth since the 1970s. It started when researchers hung weights from the wings of chickens to stretch their lat muscles. An odd experiment, I'll admit, but just from this stretch alone, the chicken's lats grew by 170%. Then, in humans, they tried something similar. Extreme loaded stretching. They tested this on the chest and even on the calves, where my friend Dr. Eric Helms wore an intense stretching calf boot for an hour a day. Both muscle groups saw almost as much growth from loaded stretching as you would expect from normal strength training. This gave researchers a clue that something about stretching the muscles seems to be a powerful signal for growth.
First off, big shout out to Eric Helms for doing his calf training case study experiment. It's worth noting he actually curtailed the experiment because of how painful the protocol was. The orthotic device being used was stretching his calf at such high intensity, inducing so much pain, that he eventually called it quits. It's great that Jeremy referenced the Woolen study on the pecs here. There's also research in larger samples than just Eric Helms in the calves comparing calf stretching protocols using that device to regular calf raises, finding similar hypertrophy in the calves. With that being said though, the impact of long duration stretching protocols, oftentimes using orthotic devices or stretching for an hour a day, is not necessarily the same thing as doing training in the stretch in the gym. If you're doing lengthened partials, for example, you might be spending an extra 30-60 seconds per workout for a given muscle group in the stretch. Compare that to stretching for an hour a day at high intensities. The duration and intensity are quite different in those two cases. And so while the concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy dates back to the 20th century, studies in animals, etc., that's not necessarily the same thing we are observing in humans in the context of training, like lifting, in the stretch position. The duration of exposure, the intensity of exposure, and many more things are quite different. And it's one of my biggest pet peeves to equate stretch-mediated hypertrophy with training in lengthened position.
How can we transfer these odd stretch benefits into normal training? One way they tested this was by comparing tricep pushdowns to overhead tricep extensions, which places the long head of your triceps into a deeper stretch. That deep stretch led to 1.4 times the growth. Remember this exercise, because later on, you'll learn why exactly it works so well for the triceps. But what if you didn't just stretch the muscle more, but actually challenge the muscle most when it's stretched? To test this, researchers would have people hold a max contraction with their legs fixed at different angles. When their leg was more bent, which challenges the quads in a more stretched position, their muscles would grow up to twice as much as when their leg was straighter and the quads not as stretched. But they didn't stop there. They tested it again using real reps, comparing the bottom half of a leg extension to the top half. And again, the version that hit the stretch harder led to way more growth. And that is when the trend exploded.
I love how he's illustrating these concepts here, using isometrics, using the lengthened partial versus shortened partial research. It's worth noting, though, that this wasn't just one group of researchers. Like Jeremy mentioned earlier, in total, we have around, I believe, 5 to 7 isometric studies. We have over a dozen lengthened partial versus shortened partial studies. There's a lot of research here. It's not just one group of researchers, and it's not just a single study. In fact, you could argue there's about as much research behind the stretch causing more muscle growth as there is behind more volume causing more muscle growth, or training closer to failure causing more muscle growth. The number of studies involved and the consistency of the findings is pretty comparable.
Stretch-focused training became the answer to everything. Faster gains, S2 results, weird optimized exercises that look nothing like what we used to do. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized there were 3 serious gaps in the research that no one was really talking about. First of all, almost every study showing that training in the stretch helps muscle growth has only been done on the biceps, quads, or calves, because they're easier and cheaper to test.
Broadly speaking, Jeremy is correct here. Ultrasound is quite cheap to run. Although an ultrasound machine oftentimes costs around $10,000, to actually run a scan costs next to nothing. All you need is someone trained with the machine to perform these scans and assess muscle hypertrophy. However, ultrasound is most effective for more superficial muscles that lie closer to the skin and therefore are easier to scan without excess fat tissue or other muscles getting in the way of the scan. The quads, calves, and biceps just all happen to be pretty superficial. With that being said, though, we do have several studies in the triceps, we have several studies in the hamstrings, we have a study in the glutes, and we also have a study in the side delts when it comes to hypertrophy from the stretch. So while there's some truth that we focused on a few muscles because they're more accessible, that doesn't mean we don't have good overall research either.
Muscles don't stretch the same way, and some are built completely differently. One muscle in particular, research has shown gets a crazy growth response from the stretch that we don't see in others. I'll reveal what that muscle is at the end, plus how to train it. But second, many of these studies, they compare totally different exercises. For example, preacher curls versus incline curls. Preacher curls hit the biceps hardest in the stretch, and they did show more growth in one study, but they also lock your arm in place, making it harder to cheat. So was the extra growth from the stretch challenge, or the extra stability, or both? And third, this one's a bit more technical, but most studies measure growth using ultrasound. It's fast, it's cheap, and I've used it myself in past videos, but it has limits. Not every muscle can be accurately measured with ultrasound. And for the ones that can, it only provides a snapshot of a muscle by looking at the thickness, often at just one point. This is an issue, especially with stretch research, as muscles don't grow evenly from top to bottom. So while one region might look like it grew more, it could have grown less in other areas. Now these issues sound small, but once you see how they played out in our study, you'll understand why they matter so much.
I mostly agree with his points around confounders here. We do have a lot of studies comparing different exercises. For example, incline curl versus preacher curl, squat versus hip thrust, lying leg curl versus seated leg curl, seated leg curl versus Nordic hamstring curl. The list goes on. These exercises differ in more than just how much stretch they put the target muscle under. And other factors could be confounding the results. For example, a difference in stability between 2 exercises. It's like if you run a study looking at the impact of how wealthy you are on how fast you drive. You might see that richer people drive faster, but that's not really because they're richer. It's because they have more expensive cars that can go faster. Effectively, there's another variable at play that is actually explaining the results. In the case of these studies, though, it's worth noting that many of the variables people often put forward for explaining why the more stretched exercise caused more growth aren't necessarily variables that have been clearly evidenced to cause more hypertrophy. For example, if the impact of greater stability during the preacher curl hasn't really been shown to cause more hypertrophy. And so while you could say, well, in this study, they only found more hypertrophy from the preacher curl compared to the incline curl due to the greater stability the preacher curl offers, the evidence backing the reasoning that more stability will lead to more growth is surprisingly shaky. When it comes to his point on regional hypertrophy, I agree wholeheartedly. Most studies only measure 1 or maybe 2 sites for a given muscle group. Getting more complete regional hypertrophy data would be helpful, especially because some of the research I've been involved in suggests lengthened training might slightly bias more distal regions of a muscle group, closer to its insertion site. On the flip side, it is worth noting that nearly no study to date, to my knowledge, has found more proximal growth from shorter muscle length training. In other words, training in the stretch seems to cause more growth whether you're looking at more proximal sites or more distal sites, but the difference in growth seems to be larger for more distal sites. So you're getting the same or slightly greater growth with stretch training as compared to regular training, or at least that's what the literature so far said. But let's see what Jeremy says about his study here.
But now comes the hard part. How do you actually design a study that fills in these 3 gaps? First, I reached out to my local university and put together a research team. And we also collaborated with some of the smartest minds in the field, including Brett Contreras and Kasim Hansen, to build the plan. The goal? To test muscles that rarely ever get studied, and to see if the benefits of the stretch, which worked for the quads, calves, and biceps, would hold up when applied to muscles like the chest, glutes, side delts, and rear delts. And because these are muscles that can't be measured accurately using ultrasound, we needed to get the gold standard, MRI. So MRI gives us a full 3D model of each muscle, and it's incredibly precise. But it's also insanely expensive, costing roughly $1,000 an hour. For our study, we needed at least 20 hours. And well, you can do the math. This was a huge chunk of our budget, and I'm incredibly grateful that Brett Contreras, also known as the glute guy, stepped in to graciously help us fund it, which left us with just one more problem left to solve.
I just want to give a quick shout out to both Jeremy and Brett here. As much as I've talked about YouTube science experiments oftentimes potentially doing a disservice to the industry, I do think funding studies with larger sample sizes and then presenting them to an audience within the right context is doing a huge service to the industry. Because instead of relying on effectively case studies and convincing viewers based on my N=1 experience, this is what you should do, you're funding an actual study with a larger sample size, better control, and then communicating to the audience what the overall literature says. So huge congrats, huge props for this.
So we wanted to test if an exercise that's hardest in the stretch actually builds more muscle compared to if we could somehow make that same exercise hardest in the squeeze. If the stretch grew more muscle, it would validate every exercise swap and adjustment science-based lifters have been recommending for years.
Sorry, pause. This study should neither validate nor invalidate every decision around the stretch ever. It is one study in the context of over 3 dozen. Again, let's look at the hierarchy of evidence. A single randomized control trial is far below the whole literature as summarized in a meta-analysis or a systematic review.
But if the squeeze built more muscle, that would mean all those recommendations weren't necessary, or even worse, were actually hurting your gains.
Again, no. As much as it reinforces the narrative of this video to say that this single study can disprove a whole trend or can prove a whole trend. 1, science doesn't prove or disprove anything. And 2, this is a single study. And this is exactly the sort of thing that I was worried about when it came to YouTube science experiments. When you place a single experiment on a pedestal and you fail to communicate how much of an impact it should really have on the consensus, on people's training applications, you are doing the community a disservice in that case. I'm not saying that's what Jeremy is doing here, but I'm saying that's what we're tending towards. I'm sure Jeremy will clarify his stance at the end of the video, but for the time being, please do not think that a single experiment will ever prove or disprove how you should train.
But how exactly do you take the same exercise and make it harder in the stretch for one group and then harder in the squeeze for another? And that is where our equipment became the key to the whole experiment. Prime Fitness USA, they provided us with 3 custom machines for lateral raises, hip extensions, pec flies, and reverse plies. But here is a really cool part. So with a simple turn of a knob, we could change the resistance profile instantly. With this knob, we can make pec flies brutally hard in the beginning when the chest is stretched, or hardest at the end when it's fully squeezed. But aside from that one change, the exercise and the range of motion stays exactly the same, meaning the only thing that could affect growth was whether the movement was hardest in the stretch or in the squeeze. It was the cleanest test of stretch versus squeeze ever done. From here, we recruited 20 subjects, both men and women. And while 20 people might sound like a small sample size, we used a unique design that controls genetics, diet, and all other individual variables that usually muddy the results.
So I'm pretty sure he's going to mention within participant designs here, meaning you're training one side with one approach and the other side with another. And that's a great way to minimize the impact of confounding variables, things like lifestyle, genetics, sleep, stress, etc. Meaning that for a given sample size, we get a higher statistical power. Statistical power just refers to a study's ability to detect an effect if it is there. Or in other words, to find a true positive effect. With that being said, and I'm looking forward to seeing the manuscript of the study, chances are that even with a within participant design, a sample size of 20 simply isn't large enough to guarantee a very high level of statistical power. And so yet again, that adds to the whole conversation of this is a single experiment, not with a particularly large sample size, mind you. It should not overturn how you train. It does not prove or disprove anything. It should simply be added to the totality of the evidence that you consider.
It's called a within subjects design, which splits each person in half. One side of their body did the stretch focus training, and the other side did the squeeze focus training. This now makes our 20 subject study statistically much stronger than a regular study with well over 40 subjects. And my hypothesis, as well as the hypothesis from the rest of our research team, was that the stretch side would no doubt outperform the squeeze side.
Pressure on the heel, nice and tall.
And by the way, this is not meant as a slight upon Jeremy at all, because MRI is expensive. The reason he didn't get more participants in is because running studies is a lot of work and it's very expensive. So I totally understand why he opted for a sample size of 20. And the reality is, that is just how exercise science works. We tend to get a lot of smaller studies that we then aggregate into one larger meta-analysis. Why do we get a lot of small studies? Because we don't have money and we don't have time. And because broadly speaking, funding bodies aren't that interested in how to grow maximum muscle in your biceps. They're more interested in how do we minimize cancer risk, which honestly is fair enough. But it does mean that when we look at individual studies in exercise science, we shouldn't be weighting them that heavily. Rather, we should look at the totality of the evidence and not overemphasize the results of a single study and its impacts on your training.
That leg down and back, good, and controlling up.
However, when I got to talk to some of our test subjects, most of them were predicting the exact opposite.
I think my left leg, which is the one that gets harder near the end, is going to more.
Really?
Just because it's harder.
JJ's my friend and I enrolled him in the study, and I mean, like, ever since like 2 weeks ago, I just kind of noticed he was getting some wicked gains on his shoulders.
Is one shoulder noticeably bigger than the other?
That I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
But definitely there's been some size growth. We'll see. We'll see in the MRIs though.
Interesting.
I'm not gonna lie here, the experiences of the participants just smells like confirmation bias, but hey-ho.
To ensure no one's bias would actually influence the results, we blinded everything. The MRI analyst nor a statistician knew which side was which, and I didn't see any results until the stats were finalized.
This is really cool. Double blinding both the researcher and the statistician removes potential causes of bias in the analysis. This is a really solid way of reducing bias in a study. And nowadays, I would say most studies in exercise science do this. Nevertheless, props to Jeremy for doing this.
Now, analyzing the MRI data alone took Adam Jones, our head researcher, over 200 hours, as every single image had to be manually outlined and measured. But our adherence was insanely high, 97%. Out of 400 possible workouts, 388 were attended. And as a result, most people's muscles grew by around 20% bigger, which is excellent for just 10 weeks. And it makes it more likely that if there was a difference favoring one side, we'd be able to catch it. And the results we found didn't just challenge my views, but also that of my fellow science nerd, Jeff Nippert, who had some interesting thoughts when I showed him the results. But we'll get to that in a bit. So, which side grew more, stretch or squeeze? Now, before I say the winner, I want you to take and guess which side won. No cheating by skipping ahead. Stretch or squeeze, just lock in your answer. Okay, so after $40,000 spent and a year of hard work, our results were chest, same growth. Side delts, same growth. Rear delts, same growth. And glutes, same growth. Every single muscle grew the exact same amount on both sides.
Pretty cool results. As I mentioned before, don't think they should shift our consensus that much.
There weren't even trends suggesting that one side performed better. We even reported growth at 3 points along each muscle to see if maybe the stretch affected certain regions more, as well as one total volume comparison. Still, same growth. I was honestly shocked. But when I dug deeper into the data, which I'll show you in a second, it actually explains why so many of us were misled, which leads me to our final question.
Real quick, You should not make the assumption that you were misled in dozens of studies on the basis of one study with a relatively small sample size finding no results. The odds that a study with a relatively small sample size will find a true effect, if it is there, aren't perfect. In fact, they're likely often in a range of 30 to 80%. And again, this isn't a slight on the study. It's simply how the game works. You don't have infinite money. You don't have infinite time. You do your best with your resources. But this grand narrative of misleading or the single study somehow overturning a whole body of literature probably just isn't accurate. All it would take for this video to become a lot more transparent would be to just show the graph of the hierarchy of evidence once.
And what are the stretch-focused exercises that actually matter? Okay, so after comparing data from our study against past research in the field, I noticed a few things. First, when it comes to the stretch everybody keeps talking about, it's not all one thing. In fact, I would say it's actually 3 different ideas that just get mashed together. The first of which is what I'm going to call the degree of stretch. So not all muscles are built to stretch the same way. Some of them, which are mainly found in your hamstrings, quads, calves, and triceps, they're biarticulate. And that just means they cross 2 joints, which lets them stretch further than most other muscles. And here's the important part. Studies consistently show that exercises that stretch these muscles more grow them faster. And because these muscles are also some of the cheapest and easiest to test, it makes sense why so many studies found stretch training to be more effective.
I think this is an interesting rationale. However, to be direct, it is simply lacking research. Jeremy is right that most studies in the area, due to feasibility, are in the quads, calves, and biceps. And yes, some of those muscles, the calves and the biceps, happen to be biarticular. When it comes to the single most studied muscle, on the other hand, the quads, most of the studies don't look at biarticular muscles. They look at the 3 heads of the quads that are monoarticular, aka they only extend the knee. And yet these studies still find the benefit of training in more stretch position. More importantly, what Jeremy's claiming here, that single joint muscles wouldn't benefit as much, just hasn't really been studied yet. So while it's certainly possible that Jeremy's right about this, it's not really been researched yet. So it's more speculation at this point than anything else.
Now, the second way the stretch gets applied to training is through basic range of motion. So how deep you go on each rep. And again, studies find that the stretch position, often the bottom part of a movement, tends to be the most important part for growth. So if you're simply not going deep enough on an exercise to reach that point, that will most definitely limit your gains. And again, nothing in our study contradicts these findings, as both our stretch group and our squeeze group were still completing a full range of motion each rep. What our study tested was the third and most misunderstood piece of the stretch conversation, the resistance profile. Does making an exercise harder in the stretch actually lead to more growth? And from our study, the answer is a clear no. As long as the exercise takes your muscle through a full range of motion and there's at least some tension in the stretch, it doesn't seem to matter if the hardest part is at the bottom or the top. And these findings, they actually line up with another brand new study published just this year that compared cable lateral raises to dumbbell lateral raises. Even though one of them was designed to be hardest at the bottom in the stretch and the other hardest at the top during the squeeze, both led to similar shoulder growth.
So, Jeremy is correct here. There is another study that I was actually involved in that I co-authored in the side delts, also finding that similar hypertrophy was seen with dumbbell lateral raises versus cable lateral raises. However, there are other studies on the impact of resistance profile, aka where an exercise is most challenging on hypertrophy. And the studies he hasn't mentioned here, which do have some limitations, actually contradict what he's saying here. First, we have a study by Milo and colleagues, which compared the Nordic curl to the seated leg curl with a forward lean. The seated leg curl with a forward lean maximizes the stretch in terms of muscle length on the biarticular hamstrings, whereas the Nordic curl with the hips extended reduces stretch on the hamstrings, but does have more resistance or more challenge at the very bottom of the rep, when the short head of the hamstrings is most stretched. Since the short head of the hamstrings is monoarticular, meaning it only flexes the knee, its length is the same in the Nordic curl versus the seated leg curl. The only difference for that muscle is that in the Nordic curl, you get more resistance at the bottom. What did the results show? Well, the seated leg curl with a forward lean caused generally more hypertrophy of the biarticular hamstrings, which experienced more stretch during the leg curl. However, the short head of the hamstrings, which simply experienced more resistance and challenge in the Nordic curl, grew more from the Nordic curl, and that does suggest that having more resistance in the stretch benefits hypertrophy. Then we have several studies comparing the incline curl to the preacher curl. There are differences between these two exercises, which, as Jeremy mentioned, might confound the results. With that being said, in the preacher curl, there's more resistance near the bottom of the rep, whereas in the incline curl, there's more resistance in the middle of the rep. Let's focus on the findings in the brachialis and brachioradialis. These muscles only flex the elbow. So, whether your shoulder is behind you, like in an incline curl, or in front of you, like in a preacher curl, don't impact its stretch at all. Instead, when it comes to the stretch, the only real difference is where the movement is hardest, either in a more stretched position for the preacher curl or in a less stretched position for the incline curl. And in these several studies, we do generally see more brachialis and brachioradialis hypertrophy when training the preacher curl as compared to the incline curl, suggesting yet again that a more lengthened biased resistance profile, aka more tension in a stretch, is beneficial for growth. So while Jeremy mentions 2 studies here, his own study and our study in the side delts, he's actually missing out on several studies in other muscles, which directly contradict his rationale. And that's not to say that we clearly know that biasing the stretch in terms of resistance profile is for sure important just yet, because we simply don't. There's not quite as many studies on resistance profile as opposed to training in the stretch more generally. However, when assessing the truthfulness of a claim, you don't just consider 2 studies, you consider all the studies on the topic. But let's see whether or not Jeremy mentions those studies.
Now here is where things get even cooler. Some muscles, they do still respond differently to the stretch, and I'll show you which ones in a second. But I first want to cover some of the limitations of our study. For one, we used untrained subjects. Now some argue that beginners grow from almost anything, so they're not ideal for detecting smaller differences between training methods. And while that is a fair point, it's also worth noting that most research in this area does use untrained participants and still finds clear differences between the groups. But I do think that for well-trained lifters like myself, doing something new can often spark growth. And I actually think this happened to me. After years of only doing dumbbell lateral raises, which challenged my shoulders hardest in the squeeze, switching to cable lateral raises at hip height to make it harder during the stretch seemed to grow my shoulders much faster. Now, whether it was a new stretch challenge that I wasn't used to or simply me just enjoying the exercise more and pushing harder, it worked. And the good news is that this isn't an either-or situation. You can do both in your workouts like I do, because we still don't know if combining both stretch and squeeze-based exercises leads to better long-term results.
First, I'm somewhat skeptical of the concept of novelty leading to more growth. I would have loved to see some citations here, but there were none. Second, while Jeremy said we had no studies looking at combining stretch-focused and shorten-focused exercises, we do actually have a study. And that's a study by Hinson and colleagues, which I'll pull up now. Its title is Mixing Up Muscle Lengths, the Effects of Training at Different Muscle Lengths in the Elbow Flexors. They compare the bicep hypertrophy of 2 different training approaches. In one training approach, all training was performed in the stretch position with high tension in the stretch. In the other condition, half the bicep training was performed in the stretch position with high tension, but the other half was performed in a more shortened position with higher tension in the squeeze. And generally, the bicep hypertrophy was the same or slightly better in the condition that trained only in the stretch position. The results suggested that the arm that trained only in a stretch position potentially grew a bit more than the arm that did half their training in the shortened position and half the training in the stretch position. This is only one study, so we do need more research. But when you combine this with the rest of the research, it does seem like biasing the stretch heavily or exclusively is best. Just wanted to mention this study here, since Jeremy didn't.
Although we tested muscles that had rarely been studied before, there are still others that may have responded differently.
To be clear, while Jeremy here is alluding to a potential difference between how one muscle responds and the next, this study doesn't really provide evidence of that. It is one study with a relatively small sample size, and it's the first study in several of these muscle groups. To claim that this study shows that these muscle groups do not respond to the stretch is, quite frankly, a stretch. And I would love to see Jeremy acknowledge here that this study is only one very, very small piece of this puzzle.
One of the few muscle groups that respond extremely well to training in the stretch. So much so that one study even found that doing just half reps at the bottom in that stretch led to more growth than doing full range of motion reps. But here's what I think is actually really encouraging. Even though this is just one study, if future research on more muscles continues to align with what we found, it means something important. As long as you're training hard and you're not cutting your range of motion short, there's actually a wide range of exercises that can be very effective for growth. Hip thrusts, for example, can be just as good as squats for your glutes. Reverse dumbbell flies can be just as good as cables. And chest flies might just build your chest as much as the bench press, which is all great to know if you're working around an injury, limited on equipment, or just want something that's easier to recover from.
As Jeremy said, this is just one study. Jeremy would need a lot more research to be able to claim confidently that these muscles don't benefit from the stretch. But I get it. As far as the narrative for each video goes, saying our study disproved this is a lot more compelling than here's an additional study on something we already have 3 dozen studies on. That doesn't really change things much on account of it being a single study. And honestly, the thing that frustrates me the most is simply that most viewers will watch this video and take the wrong thing away from it. And it's not that I don't think this sort of video should be done or can be done. I just think it has to be done right. When we conducted our study in Lehman College with Brad Schoenfeld on the stretch, for example, my video about it centered around half of the video around discussing prior research and how a single study should only shift the consensus or the prior belief by as much as the data really supports. Because a single study is just that, a single study. And when you have dozens of other studies to consider, it shouldn't be weighted that heavily. The viewer shouldn't come away from the video thinking, wow, people were wrong about the stretch, or people were wrong about training volume, people were wrong about protein. That's not how this works. If the single study is a well-done, large sample meta-analysis, that is a lot more important than a single experimental study. But here, we're talking about a single randomized controlled trial. So let's see what Jeremy has to say.
Are these handful of biarticulate muscles that do actually benefit from the extra stretch. And these are the exercises that researchers found grows them best. So I would highly recommend making sure these are in your routine. The lats also might be another exception, but we just don't have the data yet. But that's just my opinion. And I want to talk to someone who's also been a huge advocate of the stretch to see if any of our research changes his recommendations.
Yo.
Okay, so now that you've actually had a chance to read the results, I'm really curious to hear like what you think.
Yeah, it looks amazing, by the way. Like, oh man, I didn't realize you were using MRI for it. I think it's a really, really important area that you've helped kind of fill in.
Do these findings change your, I guess, your thoughts on some of the exercises that you may have thought are like better for growth?
Kind of. Yeah, I mean, I think with the pecs, that's probably the one that like, I'm like, okay, well, now you know what? You don't get a little bit of extra range of motion by doing the bench press. Like, as long as you're training hard and, you know, doing enough sets, maybe it doesn't matter so much. So that's a cool finding. I think like my takeaway based on this new study is that like there's just flexibility, right? I think this is like, it's like kind of gets to like a deeper point about what science-based training should be and how it should be communicated. I don't think there's anyone in the evidence-based field who would be like, no, like the stretch is literally number one. Like more important than training hard, more important than how much volume you do, more important than like controlling the weight and progressive overload and consistency and all this stuff. Like that's not a take. We kind of have like a lot of the puzzle pieces in place when it comes to those like fundamental variables. And these are just like the final few pieces that we're like trying to fit in.
Yeah. And that was one of the goals with our study too.
I agree with Jeff here. I think volume and proximity to failure, aka training hard. Effectively, just pushing your training in the gym, doing more sets, training closer to failure, the sort of hard training people have been doing for decades and decades. That is the stuff that matters the most. However, even when it comes to the pecs or individual muscles like the rear delts or the side delts or the glutes, like Jeremy mentioned here, just because it's the first study in some of these muscles doesn't mean it all of a sudden means the stretch has been debunked for those muscles, because it's a single study. And when you look at research, don't get hung up on single studies. Instead, look for broad, generalizable principles. Things like higher training volume tends to cause more growth. Training closer to failure tends to cause more growth. Training in the stretch tends to cause more growth. Those generalizable training principles will be correct more often than not because they're based on a large number of studies. Reading into the results of individual studies to come away with conclusions that are based on very small sample sizes is more likely to lead you astray than sticking to generalizable principles.
Say, science-based lifters always flip-flop in their stance. But nothing in our study disproves the past research. It simply gave us more clarity as to where the stretch actually matters and where it probably doesn't. And that is what science is all about. Building on what we have, questioning what we don't, and refining our stance as we learn more.
I do think, in total transparency, that the average viewer seeing this video may think that science is flip-flopping. But that's not because it is. That's because the way the information's being conveyed makes it seem like it is. The importance of the results here, to be frank, is being overstated by an order of magnitude. It is a single study, in 20 participants, within participants using MRI, yes. But it is a single study.
This whole experience has definitely taught me to be more cautious about how I interpret and communicate new findings. And actually, this study is just the beginning. We have already started our next study, which is the first of its kind. I'm going to give you a sneak peek of that in a little bit, because when I first started this channel 7 years ago, One of my biggest dreams was to run studies just like this.
Huge props to Jeremy and Brett Contreras for actually funding this study. Let me summarize. What did Jeremy get right? What did he miss? And how does this change our training? First, what Jeremy got right. And that's exactly why we rely upon meta-analyses, or syntheses of multiple dozen studies before we come to conclusions. I love that he funded a study. I think the study, broadly speaking, was well designed. Using MRI to measure hypertrophy is great, looking at various muscle sites is great, from more distal to more regional, from more proximal to more distal. I love that he looked at muscles previous research hadn't looked at, and I like that he focused on the area of research we haven't looked at quite as much as other areas, specifically resistance profile. Here are a few things I think he missed, or potentially didn't convey clearly enough in the video. This is a single study, in 20 participants. Yes, within participant, which raises statistical power, but it is 20 participants regardless. The true statistical power achieved was likely not that high. I think the inference made in this video, that 1, this study somehow disproves prior research, or 2, that different muscles respond differently, is likely simply an overextension. It is way too confident based on this study. I think it's an erroneous conclusion to make. But let me give you my own personal takeaways. 1, based on this study, in addition to previous studies, the lateral raise study, the Milo study on hamstrings, the studies comparing the preacher curl to the incline curl, the study comparing the squat to the hip thrust, the effect of having more tension in the stretch seems to range from neutral to slightly positive. Some studies find no difference. This study by Jeremy, the study by Plotkin and colleagues comparing the squat and the hip thrust, our study on the lateral raise. However, on the flip side, other studies have found a benefit. The study on the hamstrings by Milo and colleagues, the studies comparing the incline and the preacher curl. And when you add this study to the picture, the effect shifts ever so slightly closer to 0. However, because some studies found no difference and some studies found a benefit, if you have to make a decision in your own training, it is in your best benefit, if you want to have the highest odds of maximizing hypertrophy, to still pick exercises that bias the stretch. Because at worst, you'll see the same growth, and at best, you'll see more growth. But this video didn't clearly convey that, in my opinion. But you know what would be a lot more helpful in helping digest these results? A meta-analysis. And that's exactly what we're doing at this point. I'll put up a screenshot on the screen, but we're actually in the final stages of running a meta-analysis on the stretch. That includes the impact of range of motion, resistance profile, muscle length, etc. on hypertrophy across over 3 dozen studies. And the results from that will be far more interesting and of far more relevance to your training than a single experimental study ever should be. But I'll keep you guys posted on that meta-analysis. So those are my thoughts on the Jeremy Ethier stretch study. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Do you think he interpreted the results correctly? Do you think he overemphasized the importance? Let me know in the comments down below. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you again next week. Peace.